everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Do Good to Lead Well webinar podcast series. My name is Craig Dowden, I'm your host, and thrilled that you took time out of your schedule to be here today. For those of you who are return listeners and engaging live, welcome back. It's awesome to have you with us. And for those of you who have joined us for the first time, a very warm welcome. Just to provide a little bit of context in terms of this series, it really came to be around the publication of my first book, Do Good to Lead Well, The Science and Practice of Positive Leadership. And I had the extraordinary opportunity to speak with best-selling authors, top thought leaders, TED speakers, like my guest this morning, Sally Helgesen. And so wanted to open that up as a conversation. And then during the pandemic, expanded that to now include top CEOs and to have a discussion around how can we be at our best so we can unlock the best in others. And I'm thrilled to announce, and I want to thank everyone again, now the Do Good to Lead Well podcast is in the top 5% of podcasts in the world, and that could not have happened without your ongoing support, your feedback, and your enthusiasm for sharing these episodes within your network. So again, a wonderful thank you and expression of gratitude on my part. Now, I've been looking forward to this for as long as it's been in the books for me. I just have so much admiration, and I learn so much every single opportunity, every single conversation that I have with Sally Helgesen. I'm going to provide a bio, and I will not be able to do it justice. She's cited in Forbes as the world's premier expert on women's leadership. She's an international best-selling author, multiple best-selling author, speaker, and leadership coach. She's been inducted into the Thinkers 50 Hall of Fame, which honors those whose ideas have shaped the field of leadership worldwide. She's also ranked number 3 among the world's thought leaders by global gurus. Her latest book, Rising Together, How We Can Bridge Divides and Create a More Inclusive Workplace. And you can see I've got my copy and old school on my side, highlighting throughout. So you could almost ask me to go to any page and there will be highlights. It provides practical ways to build more inclusive relationships, teams, and workplaces. It soared to Amazon's #1 top seller in the field in its first week, so congratulations. Rising Together builds on Sally's remarkable success with How Women Rise, and Sally joined us in the past to talk about that extraordinary book, which is on the slide, and I would highly recommend you check it out, which she co-authored with legendary executive coach Marshall Goldsmith. This book examines the behaviors most likely to get in the way of successful women as they move forward in their careers, and the rights have been sold in 23 languages. So for over 30 years, Sally has delivered workshops and keynotes for companies, partnership firms, and associations working in 37 countries around the world. So without further ado, and again, that's a segment of her extraordinary bio. Thanks so much, Sally, for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Craig. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
Well, and again, I cannot say this enough. This is an exceptional book. I will show it again. The timing could not be more important, and I'm really excited to dig into this with you today. And also for the live audience, Sally has kindly agreed to take questions, so please take this opportunity to connect with and ask questions for the #1 expert in women's leadership in the world and a globally recognized thought leader in inclusive workspaces. So can you talk to me about and share with us what was the motivation for writing this book, Rising Together?
Well, Craig, the motivation was very clear. I was doing a women's leadership workshop at the Construction Super Conference in Las Vegas, late 2019, so it was right before the shutdown. And I expected, so this is a massive conference, and I was doing a breakout. And I expected that I would probably in my breakout have 100, 150 women who were struggling to make their voices heard in a very challenging and heavily male-dominated sector. But when I got to my room, what I found was that, #1, it was a sold-out standing room only crowd of about 300 people. and it was about 60%, maybe more, men. And I was not only surprised, but I was pretty unprepared because my talk was very much aimed at women. It was a women's leadership thing. So I kind of floundered a bit, and I was asking, some of the men, why did you come here? And they were talking about the challenge of attracting and especially retaining women in their sector. And they realized they needed to get good at it. And they thought this might help. And then one executive stood up and he said, "We hope you are not going to waste your time telling us why this is important, why getting better at leading women is important," which of course is exactly what I was going to do. And he said, "We hope you're not going to waste your time doing that. We understand all the whys. What we don't know is how to do it. We don't have a clue." So I thought, okay, that's my next book. I'll try to address it as well as I can today, but that's my next book is really the how of making a diverse workplace work and work for everybody. So that was the challenge I took on.
Well, and I love that you focus on the hows and you highlight that in the opening chapter of the book around that, because I think, and that's what I really respect and why I just thoroughly enjoy our conversations, because, and I hear this all the time where people hear inspiring ideas, interesting concepts, and then it's, what do I do with this? Like, how do I bring this from the ideation level to something practical that I can implement within my organization? And I think it's just so, it really sets this book apart in terms of not just the intentionality around the hows, it's consistent. Like every single chapter gives you things to think about and things to do so you can drive that success. So in the book, it's broken into, you talk about triggers. You have identified 8 triggers, and then you share some strategies at the second part around how we can build more inclusive workplaces. I love your discussion around triggers. So for people who are out there and, okay, interesting. So can you tell us, take that to the next level so we can be aware of triggers, how they operate? Because I think that was just such an invaluable discussion in the book.
Well, thanks, Craig. What I've found in working with people, and I've been on this topic a long time, I wrote a book called The Web of Inclusion in 1995, which was the first time the word inclusion was mentioned in the context of workplaces and organizations. So that when inclusion got paired with diversity, about 5 years after the book came out, I started getting invited to talk at diversity and inclusion events. And one of the things that I've learned by listening to people at these events is that most people go into a situation with good intentions. Their intention is not to have a terrible relationship and to show everybody else that they're better than them. There's some people like that, but most people, that's not the case. But they'll be in a situation and something will happen, usually interpersonally with another person or a group, and it will trigger them so that they can't act really on being intentional, being their best self, because they feel triggered, they feel bothered by this, they feel something isn't fair, they don't like the way someone else communicated, they feel concerned because they don't like a person's approach to humor. That whatever it is, visibility, that's a big one, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But these circumstances will trigger a response. Now, the fact is, we cannot control that. We can't control our environment generally, even though a lot of times students are encouraged to believe that they can and should. We basically can't. What we can do, however, is to try to frame more effective responses to the triggers that exist in the environment and, yes, exist in organizations and in the workplace, so that we can take a positive path forward, diffuse the emotions that we feel that can get in our way, and continue in our quest for building a broader range of positive relationships. So that's why I think triggers are so important, and that I knew that I had to address them before I went ahead with talking about specific inclusive behaviors, because they're what get in the way and can trip us up.
Right, I love that, and it's such an important idea. And you talk about, okay, what can I control? Despite we might want to try to control what's going on outside. It's the inside that really drives us. And I've got an audience question queued up. I do want to share an amazing quote. There's so many great quotes in there because I think this is such a powerful point of reflection. I'd love for you to share this because I took a lot out of this. You say, quote, "It's the stories we tell ourselves when we feel triggered that keep us dug in and limit our ability to frame an effective response." Can you talk about our mind as storyteller and how that may be operating in our conscious or even a subconscious awareness?
Well, exactly. And that's the thing. We're triggered, so we get an emotional response. And then what do we do with that response? Often, what we do is we tell ourselves a story about that person, or about that person as being like some other people. Let me give an example, specific, and it's going to be around the trigger of visibility.
Mhm.
Say we feel as if we don't get enough notice in our organization, or we can't quite break through and people don't quite know what we're contributing. And then we see somebody who's very good at this, who really knows how to speak up on their own behalf. I'm very familiar with this because I work with women, and they often will see men who are much more avid about representing their achievements and claiming visibility than the women have been. So what do I hear from the women? Oh, such a showboat. If I have to act like him, I'd rather remain overlooked. He's so full of himself. What a jerk he is. So it'll be the story. They're triggered by the visibility that he is able to compel. It makes them feel bad. And so they tell themselves this story about what a jerk this guy is. Well, that's fine. But where is the positive path forward? What do you do when you tell yourself a story like that? Either you fume silently, or you grab a friend who you think probably agrees with you and start having a gossip session about what a jerk the guy is. Men do it as well. This isn't just something women do. So in that way, the visibility trigger keeps us stuck in a narrative that will not help us move forward. It doesn't help us identify a way we could become more visible. It certainly doesn't help us identify, I'm not exactly comfortable with the way he does that, but what can I learn from that? Maybe he says, I had the client eating out of my hand. We could say, I really bonded with this client. There are ways we could frame this. So we because we're stuck in a negative narrative, we're not thinking what I can learn from that. And it certainly doesn't give us a way to develop positive relationships with people who are really good at claiming visibility, which would probably be good for us.
Mm. Well, it's such a thank you for that answer, and got lots of comments. That's awesome, very helpful. And what I love about your perspective throughout this book is that there's kind of this counterweight. Like I love the questions you provoke, and encourage us to ask ourselves, like, what can I learn from this? How can I reframe this? And so rather than get stuck in the, well, this is not fair, or this person is a jerk, or whatever it is, it's okay, so how do we shift our lens? And I think that's so incredibly powerful. Well, your namesake Sally has a question. And loved your first book, loved How Women Rise. Thank you. Excited, this book is ordered, and can't wait to read it. Maybe a loaded question, and said, I feel like I'm triggered by a lot. So any advice about someone who might be hyper triggered, so awesome, great question.
Well, you know what? I'm going to give a similar answer that I gave to How Women Rise, because I've been doing programs on How Women Rise for the last almost 5 years. It's actually 5 years next week that ago that the book came out. And I got that question from day one practically. Oh, I have 9 of these behaviors. Where should I start? I have 6. I have all 12. What am I going to do? And I always said the same thing. Start with 1. Start with whatever is easiest. Start with whatever. Identify a few triggers. Be articulate in how you identify them. So it's not just a vague feeling. I am triggered by feeling that the deck is stacked against me here. I am triggered because I feel that I can't get access to the right networks that would enable me to build a strong career. I feel triggered because I'm worried that this group of people don't respect me or think that I, deserve a place here. All those kinds of triggers. I am triggered because I don't like the kind of humor that the executives here seem to enjoy sharing. So whatever those are, identify them really specifically, take a look at this list, and then think, okay, I think this could be a little bit easier than others. I really think this could be easier. The next step is, and again, this is how I would say it. It's similar with the behaviors in How Women Rise. And then the most important step is test it out on somebody. Ask somebody. Share it with somebody. Rather than that person who you are going to grab and say what a jerk someone else is, or how unfair this situation is, or how much that joke turned you off. Rather than grab that person for that, grab that person and say, one thing I've realized is that I feel very triggered by not being a part of this network. And I want to talk a little bit about what I could do to deal with those emotions, to develop a strategy for either gaining access to that network or learning what that network does that makes it so effective, and then either joining or starting another one with that idea in mind. So run it by other people. It's very helpful to do that, and that can lead to more of these sort of informal peer coaching relationships that are so useful and essential in our development.
Well, and I love that in terms of, as you say, there's just so much in there, so much value. This is again why I'm so excited that we were having this discussion about kind of going through and picking one rather than try to do it all, and then something that's manageable so we can build our confidence. And I love, again, this is just such a core idea throughout the book, which is, and it sometimes, it may seem obvious in some ways. It's lean in, like ask, like get support from others, engage others, stress test ideas, talk about our strategies. I think that's just so invaluable. Well, I've got a great question from Steve. So Steve says, I love that the focus of this conversation has been on around balance. As a male executive, I really want to contribute to these conversations, and sometimes I feel hesitant. I don't want to derail it. So any thoughts around how I can speak up and not have a negative impact?
Yes, and I'm going to go back to the old ask somebody what they think, as opposed to just plunging in and hoping that it gets a certain response. Talk to somebody. Say there's a meeting or a gathering, or just a conversation where you are thinking, I'd really like to contribute to that. I'm not sure how this would be received. Would I be seen as whatever? Instead of just plunging in, find someone who's part of that. Say it's a group of women, and find a woman that you have a relationship with. Say, I would really like to make a contribution to this conversation. Sometimes I feel hesitant to do so. I don't want to derail it. I don't want to make it all about myself. I don't want to misrepresent what I'm really thinking. Here's what I'm thinking of saying, and how does that land on you.
Mm.
It is very, very useful. It can be eye-opening to have that. I have an example in the book of an event I went to where a very well-known, widely respected CEO was speaking. I knew his work. I knew his fantastic reputation among women in his company. And he seemed surprised that there were so many. It was a big healthcare conference for executives. And for whatever reason, because it was healthcare, he seemed shocked that there were so many women in the room. And I could see what he was doing. He put aside his prepared remarks, which were on his own lessons from leadership, and
Mm.
started talking about his wife, how fabulous she was, how brilliant she was, how she'd be better at this job than he was. And, you know, but she'd made the decision to stay home with her kids and all this sort of stuff. And the women were, really? This is what you're talking to us about? And I could see that he felt that he had to appeal to the women, and that he felt he'd done a good job. So I started interviewing just informally, because I knew I was doing this book, some of the women who'd been there, and they were like, what was he talking about? Oh, I guess he doesn't talk to many women if he thinks the only way he can talk to us is talking about his wife. Or, he was so condescending to his wife, talking about how brilliant she was. Or this was a real killer. He said, why did he say, but she made the decision to stay home with our kids? Does he feel that we are shortchanging our kids? Is that the message here? So
Wow.
he stepped in it in so many ways. It really didn't work. I talked to some of the men afterwards. He said, yeah, I bet the women really like that. He's talking about his wife. No, not so much. So it really, I thought, if this guy had asked a couple women that he works with beforehand, here's what I'm thinking of talking about, so then he would have saved himself. So we really, when we do something that is new, when we
Mm.
do something that we know in advance may feel a bit uncomfortable, we really don't want to do it alone.
Mm.
Also, the thought of asking people, consider what it actually is. It's leveraging people, leveraging colleagues in the service of your own development. How cool is that? It's a very good way to go about it.
I love it. No, such a great insights. And the questions continue to come in fast and furious, which I'm not surprised. So Tina asked, it seems like in sometimes in our environment there are competing priorities in terms of when it comes to being an inclusive environment. How do you navigate that when people may have individual things that they're concerned about? So any advice around how executives can best deal with those situations?
Yeah, I mean, this is very common. And first of all, we're never going to please absolutely everybody. That's never going to happen. And as senior executives, our role is to set policies that help people bring what is best in themselves to work. So it's more what's getting in the way, as opposed to, how are we preventing that? What kind of policies do we have here that may be getting in the way of doing that, rather than how can I make sure that every single person here is pleased with what our initiative is, and not only pleased with what our initiative is, but pleased with where our initiative begins, what we begin to focus on, the areas of diversity, inclusion, equity, whatever it is. We have to make those decisions. We want to make those decisions in a maximum from a maximum point of consulting people about what they really care about, identifying what those themes are. When I work with senior leaders, that's one of the things I help them to do, is they look at all this research, they look at all these data points. Where are the themes here that will be most helpful for people here? that will give them the most support, that will remove the barriers for them. You know, does it have to do with how they build relationships? Are they feeling isolated because of the virtual or hybrid nature of the work they're doing? How can they gain greater visibility among the decision makers in the organization so they'll get a better sense of where they belong? So that's what I think is the important thing. Get as much information as you can, identify the themes, decide on your entry point. What is going to be the most important thing you're going to address? And then keep it open. It's not like the initiatives I've seen fail have been the brand new day initiatives. Okay, rank in the bottom 10th in terms of representation of women. We're going to, within 5 years, be in the top 5%. Okay, there's a recipe for problems, because you have to make such dramatic changes that you can't listen to people, and other people are going to start thinking it's unfair.
Well, and I think it's such a great point about stepping back and saying, okay, so let's look at this in terms of the barriers, and then also what problem are we trying to solve? So rather than look at the priority, so what are we looking to do? And I love that you bring us back, and that's what I think, again, there's so many wonderful hows and practices in the book, and I love the core operating ideas around, so unlocking the best of ourselves, like, so everybody is included within this environment. Got another question. This is great. Lisa said, love, just absolutely admire your work, big fan. And you've had this extraordinary storied career, successful career, and just curious, feels like we're living in a heightened emotional time. What have you seen, and any advice around how to best navigate this emotional period in our history? So was curious if you could, any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I do think we're living in a heightened emotional time. The pandemic left many of us feeling quite lonely and isolated, and sort of forgetting our chops in terms of building actual in-person relationships. I noticed it when I went back out on the road for the first time. I wasn't as easy in front of an audience as I had been in the past, and these things felt a little bit awkward. So some of us lost some of that capacity, and we have to give ourselves some kindness as we work to get it back. So I think isolation has been part of it. I think a generally divided environment politically that most of the countries that I work in are experiencing. It's fairly widespread. It's not always widespread, but it's definitely there. And I think that gives people a sense of division that can often be a little bit hard to just leave behind at work. Makes it hard to give other people the benefit of the doubt. But then also the social media thing is a huge part of this. And the way stuff can get blown up and go viral, especially around some of these issues, can be very, very punitive. And it really is smart to limit exposure there, because that, I think, just is extremely is a big factor in creating a lot of the heightened emotional environment. And this is especially true for younger people, and especially for teenagers, who, you know, it can create real issues around identity and depression, et cetera. So I think those three factors we have to remain aware of, and we have to find ways to deal with them. We have to spend more time with actual human beings. I'd love to be up there in Ottawa right now, and whatever I think you're in a hotel room doing something. It's, you know, that's one thing we want to push to do that. Even though it can feel more comfortable, you know, here I've been sitting my home office for the last 3 years, but also really staying away from anything toxic on social media. That's really important.
Well, I got lots of thank yous and such an important topic, and really appreciated your observations, and I think, you know, the kind of being mindful of, and what I'm taking away, which is so important to remember, is, you know, being mindful of the type of energy that we're exposing ourselves to, as you said, that toxic and then that it's tough not to catch that. And then also I love your observation as well, Sally, about, well, engaging back with people and recognizing, having some of that self-compassion, if you will, around that, and realizing that these are skills, social skills, so to put them in practice and benefit, reap the benefits of doing so. Got another question from Barbara. So I love this. I chuckle at this. So Barbara said, it seems like the people who talk and brag the most get so much attention. I haven't read your book yet. And then the more talented ones are quiet. Any thoughts on that, and how to that's my trigger. So
well, that's a visibility trigger, and that is a major, it kind of shades over into fairness, but exactly the way in which Barbara framed that, which is, it seems like the people who boast and brag are the ones who get most rewarded. Again, rather than, oh, he's boastful, oh, she's a braggart, oh, I don't want to be like that. What do they do that I could adapt to my style? Is there something I can learn from what they're doing? So rather than, they're this, they're that. So it's a much more useful way to approach this. Guess what? There's a reason the term "the squeaky wheel gets the grease" has been around for, I think, about 1,000 years in the English language. It's way back in Chaucer, they put it. So there's a reason for that, and that is because that's our human response. The person who asks the most questions, the person who has the most to say, the person who tells you the most about how fabulous they are, gets that message across. And this is something, I'll tell you, working with someone like Marshall Goldsmith, who I worked with very intensely for the last 4 years, who is so good at this, who is a master at this, and who is also extraordinarily generous about sharing and teaching this skill, was mind-blowing for me to see, to what positive use that willingness to talk about how, terrifically you're doing can be done, and to learn and to try to adapt that to my own style. So I'm a big advocate of that, and I will urge Barbara, is that the questioner, to especially read the chapters on, I would say, visibility. I'm looking at the book, visibility, communication, and fairness, because I think she'll find a lot of ideas for how to manage that.
Well, and thank you, and said yes, buy book purchased on Amazon. So excited for its arrival. You touched on fairness, and I could almost imagine we could probably spend our whole hour talking about fairness and beyond. It seems to me certainly to be a common trigger where people are, well, this shouldn't happen, or this isn't fair, or so. Can you talk a bit more about the fairness trigger, and then and why that's so important for us to recognize, and also how to navigate that? Because I find, and I love you talk about the idea of letting go, because there's just so much richness there, if you can share that with us.
Certainly. I think, first of all, with the fairness trigger, and this is a big one, because there is nothing, if we feel we're in a situation that is fundamentally unfair, it is very, very difficult to be fully engaged by it, because we feel like we're getting a raw deal. So this is a very important one. It must be addressed if we feel this way. And shifting the script can be very useful here. For example, one of the women I interviewed for this book, and I'll tell you about a man that I had a really great fairness story after this, but the woman that I interviewed, one of the women I interviewed a lot of people, she had been in a situation where she co-led a team with a fellow that she had joined the organization with. They'd been in the same training, they'd gone through the same training. This was at a big financial institution. And they had co-led this incubator project. and it had been very, very successful. And she felt that it was her ideas and her creativity and her thoughts and her connections that were primarily responsible for the success of this incubator. And then the institution decided to make this incubator a division within the bank. So her colleague, her male colleague, was chosen to lead it. And her response was, "That's not fair. I should have had that job. They discriminate against women. I'm not going to go to the trouble of suing them, but now I know that, I've been discriminated against, that they didn't see what I could do, and that of course they're going to choose a guy who did a less stellar job than I did." So it really poisoned her relationship with him, and he was now, of course, her boss. She reported to him, and she began to develop a very toxic relationship with him, and she was filled with resentment, and she knew that she had to do something or she would end up leaving the job and really the company because of the unfairness she felt. So she did something to provoke, I won't share the whole story because it's a funny one, but she did something to provoke a conversation with him because he was very resistant to talking about it. He knew that she resented him. He didn't want to hear about it. So she did something that provoked this conversation, made it impossible for them not to have it. And what he said was, running this as a division in this institution, as opposed to an incubator, is something that required different kinds of skills. They saw me more as a manager, he said, and that's what I think I'm good at. He said, I think they saw you as this very creative individual. And he said, my guess is that's the part of this you enjoy. Let me show you exactly what's required, what I do in this job, and let me know, is this the kind of job you would like to have here? Because if it is, I can help you get it. I assume this didn't play to your comfort zone. So when they went through what he actually did, she thought, this is not suitable for me at all. So what she realized is that she had written this whole script that was based on a completely inaccurate assumption, and that was that he was chosen because he was a man, and not that he was chosen because he was somebody who had demonstrated from day one that what he wanted to do was to manage large divisions within this financial services company. So she was able to find different roles for herself that were very satisfying. She rose very high in this organization, and he was her ally going forward. So that was how she was sort of forced to rewrite her script because she got different kinds of information.
Well, and I think that's so powerful in terms of just, again, being open to rewriting our stories. And it sounds like takes a fair amount of courage and humility and amazing on her part to initiate that discussion. Yes, I thought that was a hilarious story. So I'm glad yes, read that for sure. It's very funny. And that then it lays the groundwork, if we're open to it, to be able to learn in terms of what other people's stories are, and then we can integrate that, as you shared. Oh, well, hey, there are some things, there was information that wasn't privy to at the time. So
Exactly.
got another great question from Sonia, who was wondering, any thoughts around in the space around inclusive environments and organizations? A very popular response has been bias training. So an unconscious bias, and so skeptical, curious, any observations around that in terms of its impact and how it advances building more inclusive environments?
Yes, and the inclusive environment is what we're trying to do here. We've got a very diverse global talent population, and people who come from outside the leadership mainstream in an organization are more apt to feel and to be marginalized. So an inclusive environment is what is the path forward for a diverse culture. The inclusive bias training, which has, I think, almost become a default for organizations in terms of doing diversity and inclusion, doing diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's a sort of default. That's what they've been doing. And part of this purpose of this book, really, for me, has been to try to provide an alternative. I have heard for years from clients who said, oh, we rolled out inclusive bias training, to our top whatever number of employees worldwide, huge commitment. And then you'll talk to them later, how did it work? Well, we didn't get quite the results we thought we would. Now, I'm sure there are cases where where companies get great results. So it's very dependent on the trainer. However, there are a couple things about unconscious bias training that I believe are fundamentally problematic. And they are enshrined in the two words, unconscious. They have to do with the thoughts in our head. It doesn't have to do with our actions, how we treat people. There's no how about it. It has to do with unconscious assumptions that we might have had from childhood. That's where it starts. So it starts at a very tough place to address, and at a place that basically doesn't have that much impact except by 2 degrees of separation on what we do. It's easier to, and it's also easier to change what we do than how we think. And we're more likely to change how we think if we do new things, get different responses. The example I just gave of the woman who said, oh, okay, that's why they chose him. She was able to change her thinking because she took an action where she engaged somebody. The other thing has to do with the word bias, which is inherently negative. So we're going into a situation where we're focused on unconscious material that is negative. I don't see that as the most positive kind of situation. There is also a hierarchy in terms of bias. Some kinds of bias are seen as more valid than other kinds of bias. I have interviewed and have a extensive story in the book about a fellow who was an engineer, and his company sent him to unconscious bias training. And he'd gotten this box ahead of time that had all these things, check your privilege. He was supposed to identify all the ways in which he was privileged. And he said, I came from a very poor family. Took me 6 years to get through engineering school because I had to work. I didn't feel like I was particularly privileged, he said, but I knew that I had to put down white male, that was part of my privilege. He said, and I was very glad that I did, because when I went to the training, what the trainers made clear was that I was in the most privileged possible group. He said, and what I saw, he said, our company had made this commitment that we were going to promote 50% women to everything, no matter what, no matter how small the pool was, that's what we were going to do. He said, fine, I don't have a problem with that. I think women have gotten, messed over for decades in our organization and in our sector. He said, that's not the problem. He said, but then I'm supposed to act like that's not a privilege at all, and that, I'm the one who has all the privileges, even though, I see men getting passed over. So he said, in terms of bias, it just didn't really quite add up, that I wasn't allowed. We're supposed to share our authentic thoughts. But I knew that if I shared that it would not be well perceived. So it did not serve his engagement. One more thing I'll say, I was on a podcast with Lisa McLeod. She has a terrific podcast a couple weeks ago. And she was telling me a story that when she was in an early unconscious bias training at the consumer products company that she was a part of years ago. And she was the only woman, and there was one black guy. They were on a big sales team, fairly high ranking. And so they went to the session and they got to hear what all their white male colleagues, their discomfort they felt at, their skepticism about whether women or Black people were up to doing the job, whatever that was. So she said, we couldn't unhear what we heard there. It
Mm.
was so upsetting. She said, we both left because who wanted to be in that situation? So urging people to be totally authentic about every negative thought they've ever had doesn't create, it might be fine in a consciousness raising session in the 70s where everybody's sitting around complaining. I was part of them too, but it's not suitable for people who then have to go out and work together. So I think it's been negative often for many people. And I would like to propose something that's positive and that is focused on actions that we can take. What we do, not what we think. And that's why I wrote Rising Together.
Well, and again, I think that's such a powerful point that you made, particularly around biases being negative, like negatively associated. It's something negative, so then we're drawing our energy in that direction. And as well, I really appreciate okay, so what are the behaviors? What are
Mm.
the things that we're doing that's observable? And then we're going to see that, and then let's be more mindful of shifting those, the words we say, the things we do, because that's going to really have a profound impact in terms of our future. So I think that's so great. And again, got lots of comments about so wonderful, very thoughtful answer around a complex question on biases. So lots, I can't even read all the positives that came from that, Sally. You touched on the being authentic and sharing that authentic voice. One of the parts of the book for me, which I really enjoyed reading and reflecting on and went over it a couple of times, was around the authenticity trap. And there's so much emphasis these days, right, about being authentic and being authentic. And so I would love for you to walk us through what the authenticity trap is and how it could prevent us from engaging most effectively with others.
Yes, and there are many reasons why we're being urged to be our authentic selves, which is a part of the discourse, if you will, in many organizations today. For people who come from outside the leadership mainstream, they may have been trying not to be themselves or not to disclose who they actually are in order to fit in. For decades, this has been happening. You think of it, especially when you think of LGBTQ people who were not even, basically didn't even feel that they had permission to say, who they were married to or who they lived with. So these things, are part of a heritage. And as we move forward and get more real, there's a lot of urging people to, bring your authentic self to work. It's also thought to be a source of great energy. And in some cases it is, but it can shade over into what Marshall has a great phrase. He calls it an excessive need to be me, where we privilege being ourselves as the most important thing that we can do in any situation, in any meeting, in any gathering. And often what feels authentic in that moment is a feeling, is a response, is a resentment, is a negative perception of another person. But as we're being urged to always be authentic, we can get the idea that sharing that is perfectly appropriate and important because after all, that's me, that's who I am, that's just what I think. It also serves as a great way for people who are very negative on the fact with the whole notion of having to work with people they may perceive as different, because that's their authentic self. And certainly you hear that, you hear people who are very involved in a backlash against this. Well, I call it as I see it. I feel that this is my genuine opinion and it has validity and blah blah blah. So it can unleash a lot of not too lovely things, this authenticity quest. So I think what we want here really, what serves is a balance between authenticity and being a professional, showing up. What is the professional thing to do here? How can I behave as a professional in this situation? What are my commitments there? And use that to some degree almost as a frame to think about, where the sort of authenticity or the individuality shows up there, because purely professional is kind of just robotic, whereas we're flesh and blood people with interesting backgrounds and perceptions. But we want to keep those in balance.
Well, and I love that, and thank you. And again, lots of positive comments, and what I really enjoy about the discussion, and I couldn't agree more that people can use authenticity as kind of like, well, I'm just going to be a jerk, like unleash my inner jerk, because that's me being authentic. And what I love, and it's so beautifully intertwined with the thesis of your book, which is around, well, in an inclusive environment, my authentic self is part of it. Well, so is yours. Like, so it's not about, I'm just going to railroad people and, well, it's not up to me to worry about that stuff. And it's just such an important point. And I love, as you framed it, thinking, asking ourselves questions, pausing, and we're under 10 minutes, so we're getting close. And
Uh-oh.
yeah, the time has flown by, and Sally has a packed schedule. So well, I've got a fabulous question from Trevor. So I'm curious about the answer to this. So Trevor asks, it sounds like the triggers, kind of having a high level of self-awareness is important. Are there certain ones that you find people are less inclined to spot within themselves? They have a harder time seeing their trigger. I love that.
Well, I do find that. And I'm going to briefly address two of those that I think are hard to spot. And one has to do with how we build our networks. And this is in the chapter, The Network and the Grapevine, and how we use our networks. And do we use our networks to leverage a range of relationships so that we can all move forward? Or do we use our networks, kind of in a toxic way to cement our feelings of powerlessness and to complain about those? And there's a lot of that. So how proactively do we build the kind of networks we would like to be a part of, and we recognize can benefit us and can benefit others? That can really trigger a lot of feelings, because it's easy to feel outside. I think it takes us back to, junior high or something, like, well, I'll never be part of the popular girls, whatever that is, or well, I'm not an athlete, so, I'm not a hero here. And the emotions can kind of revert there. So I think there's a lot of that unconscious pain around the whole subject of networks and what we're part of. The other one has to do with humor, and that is where the use of humor is appropriate, what kind of humor is appropriate. We've gotten to a point that people can be very sensitive in this environment, and it can be very punitive if somebody makes a dumb joke that doesn't go over very well. They can suffer unduly for it. And one of the things I found in talking to people about humor is that a lot of people, well, he just retired about a week ago, but like Tom Peters, who was hilarious I saw him so many times back in the day. And he was saying to me a couple of years ago, he said, I've just basically stopped using humor because it can be so problematic, and I don't want to run myself into trouble or be portrayed as somebody that I'm not. So that's sad. We don't want to be that place. Humor is so important in the workplace. It gives us a reason to show up. It makes it enjoyable. It's a fantastic way of bonding. It's a really, really important commodity. But I think that people are so concerned about how to use it. So I have a few thoughts in the book about how to use it and how not to use it. One of the things that I find is that jokes are quite problematic. I mean, when you look back into it, you see that most real jokes, did you hear the one about that kind of thing? Their humor is transgressive. They're about confounding what your expectations are. So they're often quite transgressive. And people who rely on them tend to be the ones who fall into problems with humor. Whereas people who see the humor in a situation that we share and particularly have the ability to laugh at themselves, that's the kind of humor that really does help bond people. One thing that's important, however, if we're in a very junior position, self-deprecating humor around people who are in more senior positions is probably not a good idea, because it makes us look as if we're, as if we lack confidence. And I've got a great little anecdote in there about a woman wearing flip-flops. So that really works well. But we don't want to be in that situation. Self-deprecating humor is more and more and more effective the higher we go.
Well, thank you. And got lots of comments. A couple of people saying that was my question going to ask about how to use humor effectively. So thank you. And I love that observation you just made, Sally, around how we go about on the humor side, and in particular, the self-deprecating, depending on position. And then also reminds me of our mutual friend, Alan Mullally, where he said, never a joke at someone else's expense. And
Ever.
So powerful, because that was the core operating frame. And I think it's such an invaluable reflection. So this time has flown by. Like, this has been so much fun. I can't believe we're at the hour, and I could keep going. And I know you've got lots on your plate. So thank you so much for your time. So any final observations you want to share with people, or how they can follow you and your exceptional work? Again, I cannot recommend this book strongly enough. It was so engaging to read, and I took a lot out of it. So any final words, Sally, before we say goodbye?
Certainly, Craig, and I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's been terrific. I just love all the questions that came in, and that really shows that this book is having a response. So I love that. Yeah, I'm pretty easy to be in touch with. A website is Sally Helgesen. I've got a contact button there. Anybody wants to get in touch with me. Also, I'm on LinkedIn and Twitter. And so connect with me through there, see what's going. It's been probably more posting about rising together that I'm comfortable with lately. That always happens in the first month. But I got a lot of other interesting things. Oh, and I need to say also that I have a newsletter on Substack. So it's called All Rise. So you can find that very easily. So I'm not hiding away here.
Well, that's amazing. Well, thank you so much. I learned so much. I've got so many positive comments and thumbs up in the chats, and looking forward to continuing to see the impact that Rising Together has. And in future episodes, please look for the invites. We have Gary Ridge, the former chairman and CEO of WD-40, as you tell by Sally's reaction, just top notch. And we have Yusri Basada, who's the CEO of Home Capital Group, just led an incredible turnaround and profiled in Report on Business in the Globe and Mail, joining us in the next month. So thank you so much, Sally. This has been absolutely awesome. It's always just a privilege to speak to you, and all the best. Well-deserved success. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Craig. Loved it.
Yeah, the same here. Bye, everyone. Bye for now.